Garland Nixon here, and I am with a professor and author and researcher, historian, attorney, and all of those things, Dr. Gerald Horne. We're going to talk about the Middle East. Let's talk. Good afternoon, all. Another interesting evening. You know, I just mentioned to Dr. Horne when we started, I better check the news wire to see if there's been another bombing or another war with the Biden Blinken team. If you blink your eye, you'll miss another attack. We should have had we should have saw what was coming when within a week or two after Joe Biden got in, he was bombing Syria. Let's start here. Dr. Horne, something I find interesting. Rather than start at the beginning, we'll just start somewhere. The Biden administration came out and said that the attacks took place in Jordan. The Jordanian government then came out and said, no, they did not take place in Jordan. They took place in Syria. And it appears that maybe we were misled by the Biden administration. And I suspect, and I thought about this, in the same way that Israel, under international law, does not have a right to to react in a military way towards someone who is resisting occupation. The U.S. is doing the same thing in Syria. It's an illegal occupation. Anyway, your thoughts, the attacks in Syria, what can we learn from that? Where are we here, Doctor? Where are we on the escalatory ladder, Dr. Horne?
Well, you make a fair point with regard to Syria, this improper illicit occupation, not authorized by the Damascus-based government, not authorized by the United Nations Security Council. When I heard the clash in evaluation with regard to whether the attack took place in Syria or Jordan, and let us not forget Iraq was on that list as well, I assumed that the U.S. administration was seeking to say it was in Jordan because Jordan is a close U.S. ally, and therefore an attack on Jordan perhaps would then nudge the Jordanians towards the ultimate U.S. goal and the ultimate Israeli goal, which is to turn this into an attack on Iran, which is the big enchilada. That is the ambition of Prime Minister Netanyahu. As we've said more than once, quoting the late Pentagon chief Donald Rumsfeld, his mantra was, if you have a problem, the way to deal with it is to enlarge it. Now, that sounds counterintuitive, but you can see how that works with regard to the quagmire that Israel finds itself in with regard to Gaza, where the casualty rates are quite profound and significant, not necessarily reported on by the North Atlantic press, but certainly well known to Israeli families, not to mention the fact that because of the continuing attacks from Gaza, the Israelis have had to abandon a good deal of southern Israel because of the conflict in the north with Hezbollah. In southern Lebanon, they've had to abandon a good deal of northern Israel. You see the borders of Israel shrinking steadily. There are those who've gone so far as to suggest that there might not be a long-term healthy prognostication for Israel as a state. I'm not willing as of today to go that far, but I certainly understand that reasoning. And so the idea is that if you can somehow gin up an attack on Iran, this will allow the United States to enter the fray and hopefully, from Israel's point of view, pull Israel's chestnuts out of the fire. But the U.S. administration needs to realize that it's playing with fire. I took careful and close note of the trip in the last few days of President Raisi of Iran to Turkey, where he huddled with Mr. Erdogan of Ankara, signed a number of pacts. I don't necessarily expect this NATO so-called ally, speaking of Turkey, to be in favor of an attack on Iran, which should sober the war hawks in Washington, but somehow I don't think that will happen. In any case, Washington and Israel are up to their neck in alligators. I haven't even mentioned what might be thus far one of the most significant battlefronts, speaking of Yemen, where you see that Ansar Allah, known as the Houthis on this side of the Atlantic, have imposed the de facto blockade on Israel. The port of Eilat, that's the port in Israel after ships heading for Israel go through the Suez Canal, that's the port they head to. It's gathering spider webs because of the lack of traffic, because of this de facto blockade that Ansar Allah has slapped on Israel. And also, coincidentally, I assume, this problem in the Suez Canal not only has caused problems for the Egyptian economy, which routinely garners $9 billion a year in fees from ships traversing the Suez Canal, but it's been a bonanza for China, believe it or not, because as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been chided on this side of the Atlantic, you have this railway rumbling, trains rumbling from eastern China all the way to Spain. And so European companies and European economies that would like to take advantage of the Chinese economy, they have an alternative. They can use this Chinese-built railway and basically avoid the problems of the Suez Canal. So I would urge the hotheads in Washington to cool their jets. They're getting in all too deep. Mr. Biden says that the U.S. will attack at a time of its choosing. I hope that that was shorthand for saying that there will not be any attack anytime soon, and perhaps it'll be postponed indefinitely.
You know, you bring up a good point that I didn't think about. The Russians have been saying, hey, we've got the Northern Sea route. There are various people saying, hey, as you said, we've got overland routes. This helps to, I think it really helps to push the Chinese argument that we need alternative trade routes. And I think that is based on the U.S. empire's desire to rule the high seas and, of course, to be able to control international routes of trade and choke points, etc. Let me ask you this. In a number of ways, I think we're at a very interesting point in history. For many hundreds of years, the colonial powers have worked to have had these giant armadas, these giant the ships with cannons, and then on with all of these ships to control international trade, choke points, etc. Okay. And in a matter of a couple of weeks, the Ansar Allah has thrown a monkey wrench in that. All the money that the U.S. spent to say we can control the choke points and the routes of trade around the world. We've got submarines. You may be able to deal with our ships, but we got subs. And Ansar Allah has demonstrated with a few missiles that if you have a geographically advantageous location, no matter how poor you are, you can control the trade routes in your area. Your thoughts?
Well, that's obvious. And with regard to your prefatory point, I'm sure you recall the ditty "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the seas," which was chanted, unfortunately, in London, particularly in the 19th century when Great Britain was a major power. And of course, there was something to that with regard to Britannia ruling the seas that helped it to maintain its so-called empire, where supposedly the sun never set, particularly the crown jewel that was then known as British India. And the United States inherited that mantle, particularly after 1945, with the defeat, at least militarily, of Great Britain, not necessarily politically, at the hands of both Germany on one side and Japan on the other. And so the United States picks up the mantle. But alas, we see that the United States has overplayed its hand. We see that China's in the passing lane. And your audience, I'm sure, recognizes that what helped to accelerate what was inevitable, that is to say, the precipitous decline of US imperialism, was the fateful decision made a half century ago, whereby US imperialism forged and brokered an entente with the People's Republic of China. Recall Nixon going to meet with Mao Zedong. This was on an anti-Soviet basis. It's clear that Washington overdetermined Moscow to a degree and underestimated the People's Republic of China, which had an economy 50 years ago not within hailing distance of where it is today. And so as a result of that entente, China received massive foreign direct investment from US corporations. And now you see that at the end of 2023, China has exceeded Japan and Germany as the major car manufacturer on planet Earth. You see that Tesla is now being challenged. I don't know if you've been paying attention to Tesla stock lately, but it's headed south, not least because of competition from BYD, otherwise known as Build Your Dreams, from China, which has as a major investor Warren Buffett, the so-called Oracle of Omaha, Nebraska. And of course, with the problems that Boeing is enduring, it's not only that they're facing competition from Airbus, the European competitor, but if you peer over the horizon, you shall see that China, within a few years, will probably be building airplanes that are challenging both Boeing and Airbus. And this is particularly bad news for Boeing of Chicago and the state of Washington, the latter being the manufacturing facility, because a good deal of its profits have come from selling wide-body jets to the People's Republic of China. We can already envision a time when that market will shrivel, as will be shriveling Boeing's stock price, which of course has been hammered of late because of doors flying off in midair. You know, I'm about to take a flight to Honolulu in a few weeks. And I have to say, I'm checking to see what kind of airline is crossing the Pacific, because I don't want to be on one of those Boeing planes when the door flies off in the middle of the Pacific. You know, when the door flew off just a few days ago here in the United States, they were flying overland on the west coast of the United States. So emergency landing could be effectuated. I'm not sure how you can make an emergency landing in the middle of the Pacific and that 2,100 miles that separates Honolulu from LAX, from Los Angeles. So Boeing right now is a kind of metaphor for the U.S. economy and how the U.S. economy and U.S. imperialism itself has been tripped up. But it's not just Boeing. As we speak, as a direct result of this misguided, ill-considered U.S. embrace of Israel, you see a consumer boycott of Starbucks in the region, a consumer boycott of McDonald's. McDonald's had the bad sense, at least their franchisor in Israel, to hand out Happy Meals free to Israeli reservists or cut prices. That did not go down very well in the neighborhood. And of course, Starbucks too is being hammered as a result, not to mention being hammered in one of its largest markets, speaking of the People's Republic of China. So if the United States were a stock right now, I'd advise you to short it. That is to say, I'd advise you to sell and to plot on its ever more precipitous decline.
The International Court of Justice, people have, I've watched, I don't know how many videos, people have exhaustively discussed the process and, what's happening, the potential, and what happens next, and all of that. But let me ask you this. I understand that Indonesia is now working on a similar plot, shall we say, in which they intend to challenge the U.S. empire, to challenge uh, Israel, but not on the issue of the current conflict, but on the issue of occupation. That they're going to do the same thing and go after Israel through the context of occupation, which I add has already been decided repeatedly by the UN. It's clear they're an occupation, a power of occupation. But now this will allow. Well, now I think what they're pushing for is, of course, the UN to take action. Okay, here's my point. It appears that BRICS opened a new front, if you know what I mean. They opened a new front, and the front was, you're arguing rules-based international order. So you're arguing some alternative, murky, unknown, translucent set of rules that nobody could ever really know. At the same time, the U.S. empire is always pointing to other people. You're violating international law. We're sailing through the Taiwan Straits in accordance with international law. The Uyghurs, there's something about international law. So the U.S. empire wants to have their cake and eat it too. It appears to me there's a new front open in the UN. Do you view that, not that these complaints aren't valid, but do you view this as kind of a new front wherein those who are antagonized by the hubris of the U.S. empire and the aggressiveness and assertiveness now are saying, okay, we found a new way to, take a mallet to your cranium, shall we say? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm struck by what you say about Indonesia, which has an election coming up shortly. And in a sense, this dovetails with the South African petition at the International Court of Justice on the basis of Israel violating the genocide petition, because the ruling African National Congress of South Africa also has an election coming up. And what I think your audience should infer is that parties and governments are coming to the conclusion that it's good politics, that it's electoral catnip, if you like, for their electorate to go after Israel, be it at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, or be it at the United Nations. Now, with regard to Indonesia, the largest predominantly Muslim country on planet Earth, you may recall that just a few months ago, this was before the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation gathering in San Francisco, President Joko Widodo of Indonesia met with Mr. Biden in the Oval Office, and reputedly, he pressed Mr. Biden with regard to their shameless, speaking of the United States, shameless embrace of Israel and its illegal occupation. It's also interesting to note that the United States may not be the most popular nation in Indonesia. Recall what happened in October 1965 when there was an anti-communist coup d'etat, 500,000 slaughtered on anti-communist grounds, to repeat. But what's interesting about that bloody coup, which brought in decades of military rule, was that it was also an anti-Chinese coup, because as is the case for a good deal of Southeast Asia, there is a substantial Chinese minority in Indonesia. And of course, they oftentimes play a leading role in both the economy and in progressive politics. And so this move by Indonesia that you've just cited does not come as a surprise to me, and it's more bad news for Washington and the North Atlantic countries. Likewise, with regard to the International Court of Justice opinion, which I think it's fair to say was a smashing victory, not only for South Africa, not only for the global South, otherwise known as the global majority, but also a defeat for the North Atlantic countries and its ill-fated alliance with Israel. The Israelis have been mandated to come before the ICJ within less than 30 days to report on what they're doing to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza, although I'm not sure what they're going to be able to report since they've just engineered a kind of coup by ginning up claims that the United Nations Refugee Agency, which has been attending to Palestinian needs for decades, somehow was implicated in October 7th, which has caused the United States and its allies to cut off funding to the United Nations Refugee Agency, which is going to contribute to the humanitarian fiasco in Gaza. So when Israel comes before the ICJ in less than 30 days now, I'm not sure what they're going to be able to report. And if their report is unsatisfactory, or if they have the gumption and the gall not to even show up, well, then we can expect a referral to the United Nations Security Council for further action if the United States chooses the unwise position of somehow protecting Israel by vetoing that resolution. Then it can go to the 190 plus members of the General Assembly under the United for Peace formula. And with the crafting of incisive language, that can lead to a resolution emerging from there. That may be what you're referring to with regard to Indonesia, for example. And that particular resolution could serve as a basis for tightening sanctions against the outlaw regime in West Asia. It could lead perhaps to a measure that befell apartheid South Africa, that is to say, expelling Israel from the United Nations, expelling it from a number of multilateral agencies, isolating the regime further, and perhaps the United States will be forced to acknowledge what is evident, that in some ways Israel is the 51st state. Now, I took careful note of the NBC News report in the last 24 hours that the Biden regime supposedly is considering a, quote, pause, unquote, in terms of shipping arms to Israel. Now, as a glutton when it comes to consuming the US press, I'll caution our audience to approach that item with a bit of skepticism. What I mean by that is, when you see an item like that in the press, you can't always accept it for the truth of the matter asserted, as the lawyers might say. Perhaps this is just a head fake that the Biden administration is making to assuage the Indonesians, to assuage the Saudis, to assuage other nations who are totally disgusted with U.S. policy, and they can dangle that NBC News story before their noses and say, see, we're trying to take measures. So even if that latter scenario that I've sketched may have a certain validity, that still reflects the fact that Washington feels that it has to take measures to assuage third parties. And that's good news, because that shows that Washington is feeling the heat, just like Israel is feeling the heat. Note that just before the ICJ opinion was made on Friday morning, US time, that Israel supposedly released 30 documents, secret documents, we were told, that shows that they did not have the requisite genocidal intent, which is an essential part of the South African petition. Now, this was obviously laughable because how do we know that there weren't 60 different orders and they chose to release 30? How do we know that they didn't redact or censor the 30 orders that they did reveal? And in any case, it's apparent that when Minister Gallant, a key member of the war cabinet in charge of the Israeli military, speaks of Palestinians as human animals, for example, as he most certainly did, when you have these videos that were played in The Hague of Israeli soldiers dancing and singing about massacres from ancient times, going back to the Old Testament. This was quite disturbing, quite disgusting, in fact. And I don't know how many secret orders, so-called, that Israel can release that can wash away that stain. So in any case, Israel by taking that extraordinary measure of supposedly releasing these secret documents, they showed that, like Washington, they too are feeling the heat. And I think that the message to the pro-peace, pro-ceasefire movement in this country is to keep the pressure on. Our antagonists are feeling the heat. When your antagonists are feeling the heat, oftentimes they tend to retreat. And that is the message that we convey in the latter part of January 2024.
And I'd like to ask, we've got 848 viewers, so I'd like to ask everyone to A, hit the like button, and B, if you can, share this on all your social media platforms in real time. Let me look at that article right now. It says, the Southeast Asian nation of Indonesia is taking the lead in a separate proceeding with the United Nations main judicial body based in The Hague, Netherlands, regarding Israel's longstanding occupation of Palestinian territory. Indonesia's foreign minister, Retno Marsudi, announced last week that she will deliver an oral statement on the opening day of hearings, February 19th, and that she recently convened in Jakarta around 50 international law experts to help prepare for the statement. International law must be upheld, Marsudi said. The right of the Palestinian people to self-determination must be respected. Israel's occupation of Palestine, which has lasted for more than 70 years, will not erase the right of the Palestinian people to independence. This is a very broad spectrum of alleged violations that have been committed in the region for decades and whose horrific consequences are still visible today. In the light of recent events in Gaza and the West Bank, Slovenia, as one of the few EU countries, has decided to actively participate and present its views in these proceedings. What say you about all of that, Dr. Horne?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, the current spouse of Mr. Trump, Melania, is of Slovenian ancestry. Perhaps this is a subtle message to Mar-a-Lago that's being sent. But in any case, I think that it represents the gathering storm in the international community. Israel is increasingly isolated. And in fact, one of the problems, of course, is the European Union, which does not seem to be as united structurally with regard to having a common foreign policy line as opposed to having a common economic line. And so therefore, it's possible to turn that into an advantage for the Palestinians. That is to say that we know that Spain, for example, has not been as pro-Israel as, say, London or Germany. We know that Belgium, for example, has been relatively pro-Palestinian compared to London and Germany, for example. Now you add Slovenia to the mix as well. So this is part of the good news that's coming. Now, obviously, we here in the United States have to step up our game. Now, on the one hand, there have been thousands upon thousands in the streets. Just today in Houston, Texas, believe it or not, there was a demonstration that tied up airport traffic by pro-Palestinian forces. And this is not necessarily the norm in Southeast Texas, because I'm afraid to say that just a few weeks ago, just in my backyard, figuratively at least, there were pro-Nazi demonstrations, for example, with swastikas of all things. And we also know that there's loose talk in the state of Texas about igniting another civil war because of this allegation that the Biden administration has been asleep at the switch with regard to border traffic. So the fact that in Texas you have this pro-Palestinian demonstration, hopefully that's a sign of what's happening nationally. And it's not a moment too soon, because you may be familiar with the Wall Street billionaire, Bill Ackman, who was in the vanguard of helping to lead the charge against Claudine Gay, the first Black woman president of Harvard University, descendant Haitian migrants, and of course ousted unceremoniously, forced to resign because of an apparent lack of enthusiasm for Israeli genocide. The latest news from Mr. Ackman is that he's pressuring Mr. Biden to display his mettle by bombing Iran. And of course, in that respect, he's joined Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who's never seen a war that on the part of U.S. imperialism, that he would not endorse. Senator John Cornyn and Senator of Texas and Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas have spoken similarly. But what's interesting is that there's a split in the right, which may be something we in the peace movement can take advantage of, because Tucker Carlson, the erstwhile Fox News host, has poured cold water on the idea of a bombing of Iran, just like he has been less than enthusiastic about this U.S. support for Israel. And in fact, I don't think that the U.S. press has done a good job of covering how there's a split on the right with regard to a lot of this bellicosity. Most of the time they talk about the Christian Zionists, for example, and their pro-Israel support. But I think that they would be well advised to advise their readers. So there's a split on the right. I mean, for example, at that aforementioned pro-Nazi demonstration in Houston, in my neighborhood just a few days ago, there were two major slogans. One was "Make America White Again," sort of a play upon the MAGA slogan. The other was "Down with Jewish Supremacy." And I think that folks like Bill Ackman, a Persian capital, a so-called billionaire, a leader of the Zionist billionaire class, what they need to realize is that it's highly possible that as U.S. imperialism loses altitude, not least because of this ill-considered alliance with Israel, that opens the door for the ultra-right to begin to scapegoat the Zionists for the decline of U.S. imperialism. Now, of course, we know that there are many factors involved in the decline of U.S. imperialism, and scapegoating the Zionists is obviously an insufficient explanation. But that's where we're headed. I don't know if Mr. Ackman is aware of that, and I hope that the U.S. press begins to cover this issue. But given its lethargy with regard to bringing facts and authentic truth to its readers, I'm not necessarily optimistic about that prospect.
Well, speaking of splits, let's look at this one. New York Times, Black pastors pressure Biden to call for a ceasefire. A campaign, now listen to this. They say a campaign spurred in part by their parishioners who are increasingly distressed by the suffering of Palestinians and the critical president's response to it. Now, and critical of the president's response to it. You know, we know, certainly, all of us who have studied the Tammany Hall and the history of American politics, that one of the hallmarks of particularly the Democratic Party politics is to have a person in Tammany Hall. It may be a saloon keeper, but in the Black community, it's always been some kind of a religious or moral leader, and they go to that person, and that person delivers X amount of votes. I know because I've been involved in that stuff before, right? So there's a preacher. We go there. Why? Because that's not one vote. That person can deliver vote. You know, an entire, Southern Christian leadership. They can deliver X amount of votes, right? And it appears to me that these Black preachers are now coming saying, we're not going to be able to deliver votes because people are coming to us in the pulpit. And I'm hearing in the Black community saying, we are unhappy with what Joe Biden's doing. He's not getting our votes. It seems to me an ominous sign to Biden and his party when Black pastors are coming to him saying, if you don't change directions, your goose is cooked, sir. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that that's a reasonable interpretation. We know that historically there has been a modicum of anti-war, pro-peace sentiment in the Black American community. Recall that it was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. before his tragic assassination in April 1968. came out four square against the genocidal U.S. war in Indochina. That was a factor that helped to drive President Johnson from office, announcing in March 1968 that he would not run for re-election in November. We also know, if you look at these demonstrations that have been taking place on campuses, there's been a critical mass of Black students involved in this. We have numerous Black intellectuals who've been speaking out against this genocidal campaign in Gaza. So to that extent, that New York Times article did not surprise me. On the other hand, there's another way to look at it. Look at it the way I try to examine and scrutinize critically the NBC News report that suggested that the White House may be seeking to pause U.S. military shipments to Iran. That is to say, excuse me, to Israel, excuse me.
Israel, yeah.
That is to say that that was a lengthy article. It had pictures of a number of different Black pastors. And it would not surprise me at all, given the reportage we have seen with regard to splits on the White House staff. Recall that a goodly number of the White House staff have been up in arms about what their ultimate boss, Mr. Biden, has been doing in Israel. And so this article, which, by the way, was written by a relatively young journalist, a relatively young Black American journalist too, by the way, it may have been some sort of calculated leak to her to put pressure on Mr. Biden, because as you know, Mr. Biden doesn't have a chance, a snowball's chance in hell of winning in November unless there's a significant Black turnout. And already you see Arab Americans in Michigan are turning thumbs down on Mr. Biden. If Black Americans turn thumbs down in places like Georgia, North Carolina, and Michigan, his goose is cooked. And so another way to interpret that story is a way to try to give a nudge to further Black pro-peace, pro-ceasefire solidarity, and particularly within the confines of the Black church, because recall that Mr. Biden has been spending a lot of time in Black churches. Recall that he was in Mother A.M. Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, the site of the unfortunate slaughter of a number of Black parishioners some years ago by Dylan Roof, a white supremacist. And he was interrupted by pro-peace, pro-ceasefire demonstrators. So whatever the case, either interpretation, it seems to me, speaks well for the pro-peace, pro-ceasefire movement. That is to say, the interpretation that this is an authentic expression of anti-war sentiment coming from the Black church, or the latter interpretation, that it reflects some sort of de facto alliance between unnamed members of the White House staff, disgusted and disgruntled with Biden policy, and then roping in these Black leaders and an inexperienced New York Times reporter, giving it play to the extent that Garland Nixon then displays it on his much anticipated, much watched podcasts and broadcasts.
You know, I hate to even touch on this subject, but I feel like I have to. Nancy Pelosi faced criticism for suggesting some pro-Russian protesters are connected to Russia. We have to think about what we're doing, and what we have to do is try to stop the suffering in Gaza. But for them to call for a ceasefire is Mr. Putin's message. Make no mistake, this is directly connected to what he would like to see. I think some of these protesters are spontaneous and organic and sincere, and right. But some, I think, are connected to Russia. And I say that having looked at this for a long time. She goes on to say that she says, I think some financing should be investigated. I want to ask the FBI to investigate that. I look at that. And I think of the fecklessness. I think of the absurdity now that the ruling elite of this country has become, to the point where I look at it as a pathetic cult. That you could look at 300,000 people in the street couple of months ago, 400,000 people in the street 3 weeks ago. People all blocking bridges, blocking all the things that are Jewish voices for peace in the street everywhere. Jewish organizations leading the fight. And then our ruling elite, the best they can say is, as Nancy Pelosi said once before, all roads lead to Putin. I look at that and I shake my head and I say, how can you even reason with people like that, Dr. Horne?
Well, that story saddened me in a number of different ways. First of all, it saddened me with regard to Nancy Pelosi. She's obviously losing her fastball. She's lost a step or two, and obviously she needs to retire, perhaps go into what used to be called an old folks home, because she is not doing her constituents in San Francisco, of all places, who have been outstripping other cities in terms of marching. She's not doing them any favors. And as a matter of fact, she can be accused of throwing them under the bus, asking the FBI to investigate her own constituents, probably people who voted for her. And so Nancy Pelosi obviously needs to retire and turn that seat over to someone who can better represent her constituents. At the same time, it needs to be taken quite seriously. I was apprised today of the fact that the Uhuru Three, led by Chairman Yesatella of the African People's Socialist Party, who are about to go on trial with regard to supposedly being agents of Moscow, not least because they are pro-peace, anti-war, not only anti-war with regard to Gaza, but anti-war with regard to the NATO escapade in Ukraine. They asked for charges to be dismissed. The charges were not dismissed. This is quite ominous, because we know that if they are able to nail the Uhuru Three, the authorities will then come after you and me. And this means that it's a matter of enlightened self-interest for us to raise our voices with regard to this travesty that's unfolding in federal court. But back to the sad case of Congresswoman Pelosi, I was heartened to see that a number of Arab American organizations denounced her forthwith, which of course they were determined and bound to do. And we also should realize that Nancy Pelosi is becoming something of a loose cannon. I think it was in the New York Times the other day, perhaps in the column by Nicholas Kristof, their globe-trotting columnist, who was just in Taiwan, and he has very close ties to the Taiwanese, who, as you know, just had an election where the Anti-Reunification Party, the DPP, prevailed, although it lost seats in the parliament. He said that the ill-fated trip of Congresswoman Pelosi to Taiwan in August 2022 did not do the Taiwanese any favors. And that's apparently its consensus even amongst the DPP. And recall at the time, many of us were warning that this was an unnecessary provocation, sending the then speaker to Taiwan in line for the US presidency to basically wave a red flag in front of the Chinese bull. And now Nicholas Kristof is validating that point of view. And so once again, Nancy Pelosi is becoming something of a loose cannon. Perhaps she misses the journalistic attention she received when she was speaker. Perhaps she feels she now has to manufacture and fabricate provocative stories in order to get her name in headlines. Whatever the case, she's become a rather divisive and dangerous figure. And I would urge and encourage our friends and comrades in San Francisco to see her off, to have her ride off into the sunset for, I won't call it a well-deserved retirement, but I will call it a desired ouster.
In fact, there were other reports today that there were protesters outside of her house, and she went out to them and said, "Why don't you go back to your bosses in China?" So, yeah. So it's Russia, it's China, it's whatever. I guess it's those. That's the song you're supposed to sing in Washington today. It's the neocon song. That being said, the neocons, the U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism had a plan. First, Ukraine, we're going to overthrow the government. We're going to fill it full of weapons. We're going to get this war going. We're going to take out Russia. They're going to fall apart. It's just a gas station masquerading as a country anyway. That plan's not going so well. And it appeared that they were going to take what I've referred to as, when it came to Ukraine at some point, the Samsonite option. We're getting out of there. Didn't work. We're going to leave. Off we go to Taiwan. That's where the action is now. As you always say, that's the big enchilada. So they're going to leave the EU holding the bag, and off they were going to go to China. And in between, the Middle East sprung up. Your thoughts on where the empire is? It's if it wasn't so dangerous, it would almost be pitiful to watch these people trying to hold on to this hegemony, to say, we're going to go after the Russians because, oh no, wait a minute, the Chinese, we got to get them. Oh no, that's Iran. Oh, they're the ones, Iran. And they're just looking in all directions. As I said, if it weren't so dangerous, it would almost be sad and pathetic, like a person who falls overboard and they're reaching in every direction to grab a stick, a rock, anything they can hold on to pull themselves out of the water and save their lives. And as I've said about quicksand, the more they struggle, the quicker you go under in quicksand. Your thoughts on the state of the U.S. imperial project to take out the other world powers and be the last man standing, as it were?
Well, obviously, it's not going very well. In that well-articulated litany you just recited, we would be remiss if we failed to acknowledge what's going on the Korean Peninsula. That is to say that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, known on this side of the Pacific as North Korea, has had some very significant changes of late. Supposedly, at least according to U.S. press reports, they're no longer seeing their neighbor to the south, South Korea, the Republic of Korea, as sort of a wayward partner for reunification. Given the conservatism and the ultra-reactionary politics of President Yoon in Seoul, they're beginning to characterize that particular regime as an antagonist. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is also tightening its relations with Russia. Recall the one-on-one meetings between Chairman Kim and President Putin. We expect another such meeting this year. We have been told by the U.S. press that the DPRK is supplying from its apparent inexhaustible supply artillery shells to Russia. And so this is an inflamed situation. We know that it has been normative with regard to U.S. imperialism to have war games off the coast of the DPRK. The DPRK is not a regime to trifle with, and Washington would be well advised to try to come to some sort of reasonable agreement with the DPRK. And speaking of war games, we would be remiss if we failed to acknowledge the war games taking place targeting Russia as we speak, involving NATO, including the newly emerging member of NATO, speaking of Sweden, 31 nations, if not more, involved. It's no secret, as a NATO admiral suggested in an offhand remark, that in some ways this is a dress rehearsal for war, believe it or not, with regard to Russia, because it's apparent that with regard to the failing escapade in Ukraine, that NATO is going to have to be convinced to walk away. Apparently, they too want to follow the credo of late Pentagon Chief Donald Rumsfeld, that is to say, to try to enlarge the problem by ratcheting up the stakes against Russia, and as you suggested, achieving and attaining that long desired dream of somehow effectuating regime change in Moscow, which would then be a step towards getting their grubby little paws on all of the vast resources of Russia, not to mention natural gas and oil, not to mention gold, and at the same time using that as a stepping stone towards the juiciest target of all, that is to say, the People's Republic of China. Because right now, the split amongst the two parties is that the Republicans would like to make a deal with Moscow. Perhaps they're more in tune with regard to the weaknesses of US imperialism so that they can focus like a laser beam on China. Whereas the Democrats, somehow they have this cockamamie idea that they're going to focus on both Russia and China, and that they're going to overthrow Moscow as a way to then strengthen the imperialist bloc to go after China. From the point of view of imperialism, that seems to be the looniest idea since Looney Tunes. It's absolutely wacky. And so, once again, this is a challenge to the pro-peace forces, which brings us once more to that New York Times article, because one of the weaknesses ideologically of the Black community has been steering clear of foreign policy. And what that does is that since this community plays such an outsized role in Democratic Party fortunes, that tends to strengthen the hawkish elements within the Democratic Party, the Anthony Blinkens, the Victoria Nulands, the Jake Sullivans, the Joseph R. Bidens, for example, who is a neocon of long standing. So I dare say that there were not necessarily smiles in the Oval Office when Mr. Biden, assuming he can still focus on newspaper articles, opened up his New York Times and saw this article about Black pastors joining the pro-peace crusade.
It seems to me that the Middle East is a difficult place because of the culture, the long culture of Islam, and if you get in a fight with a Muslim nation, it's probably not going to be a short fight. And when I mean not short, I mean it could be literally hundreds of years. They don't just walk away and say, okay, that's the way it is. The imperial project to go after Russia, China, etc., seems to have been greatly sidetracked now. It seems, to be quite frank, when I look at what's happening, their plan was they saw Russia and China as the big enchilada, etc. Ultimately, it seems to me there was, and of course, John Bolton said that the neocons basically saw the European Union and its, mighty economic, expansive economic power as a economic threat second only to China. So there's another threat there. They missed out on the Middle East. They underestimated the Middle East. They underestimated their exposure in the Middle East due to having all the bases there, due to having all of the having Israel there, and non-state actors everywhere. It makes it hard to punch when, as General Diop said, they come out of they're like a ghost. They come out of the jungle and strike you, and then back they go into the jungle. So they've got all of these non-state actors. It seems to me that I don't see an end point for this anytime soon, particularly when the most irrational actor in the Middle East is their partner, Israel. Israel, I don't see a way that they can get out of this anytime in the near future, that they will be entangled up here indefinitely. Anyway, your thoughts about that? The Houthis, these people are not walking away and giving up. And if for the United States to say, okay, uncle, time out. Whoa, we got to stop. And is to admit the end of U.S. imperialism. They have to try to dominate. They're in deep and serious trouble. To me, they're in more trouble there, notwithstanding the fact of nuclear peer opponents. But they're in deep and serious trouble, and I don't see how they get out of this anytime soon. Particularly, what's Israel going to look like, if at all, when they get out, Dr. Horne?
Well, as you probably know, there are those who do not have an outstanding prognosis with regard to Israel's future, which is understandable. Just reference our conversation with regard to the shrinking of the borders, the North being abandoned, the South being abandoned, the fact that the economy is seizing up, billions of dollars being spent with regard to these reservists who are ordinarily in offices and stocking grocery shelves now in the front lines. This has been a damaging blow to the Israeli economy. At the same time, of all the demonstrations that I would mention, not only the anti-war demonstrations, I would also point your audience to regular demonstrations that are taking place at the office of Persian capital of Bill Ackman. This is very important since he's trying to style himself as a kind of pro-Zionist hawk, going after Black leadership at Harvard, for example, chiding Mr. Biden for not seeking to bomb Iran, for example. So, and as we know, as students of political economy, that these capitalists, these billionaires, they're the power behind the throne. And we should go after the organ grinder as much as we go after the monkey, speaking of the president resident in the Oval Office, for example. And so I would urge and encourage those in New York City to join those regular demonstrations, because I think we need to make an example of Mr. Ackman, because, of course, he has comrades in arms. For example, Elon Musk, who he has defended, even though Mr. Ackman styles himself as some sort of a culture warrior on behalf of the Jewish American community, like leaders of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, who looked the other way with regard to Elon Musk playing footsies with anti-Jewish fervor. Recall the comments that he made on X, Twitter, the service that he has purchased, that basically endorsed an equivalent of the so-called replacement theory, that the Jewish folk are involved in seeking to supposedly replace, unquote, these hard-working middle-class, quote, white Americans, unquote, with these brown folks from Mexico and south of the border. And so these folks, they're tied up in all sorts of contradictions. Perhaps the way to look at it optimistically is that the various contradictions in which they're enmeshed is a reflection of the fact that their political position is weakening, and therefore they're not necessarily thinking soundly or thinking straight, which then leads them into these political quagmires, or to use your term, leads them into quicksand. And so we need to hasten that process, as I said, by joining these regular protests at the Persian capital. Because, of course, we know that as U.S. imperialism scans the horizon, they have many things to be worried about. I mean, for example, the fact that Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS, have acceded to new members, including the erstwhile U.S. ally that is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, of course, and perhaps it's not accidental that Iran is now in the crosshairs, just like we should not see it as accidental that South Africa took the vanguard position in filing this case before the International Court of Justice. And voila, what happens in the past few days? Secretary of State Anthony Blinken shows up in South Africa's neighbor, speaking of Angola, which the United States tried to foil its independence about 4 decades ago by aligning with apartheid South Africa. But now it's trying to snuggle up to the Angolan regime because Angola is a repository of not only oil, but diamonds as well, not to mention its neighboring country, speaking of Zambia, being a repository of copper, critical for the green economy. And so the United States supposedly is going to help the Africans in that part of Southwest Africa to build a railway so that the wealth can be more easily shipped to the ports and then sent across the Atlantic to the United States of America. And at the same time, perhaps turn Angola against South Africa, which too, as noted, is facing elections as well. So I guess that at the end of the day, the conclusion that we reach is that we should not expect U.S. imperialism to run up the white flag, no matter how many setbacks it is facing, no matter how many of its positions are collapsing. I think that it's going to be up to us to give U.S. imperialism a proper burial, because if we don't, it may go over the cliff with us aboard too, I'm afraid.
I did have one more question. I know we've been just about an hour, but my other question is, Burkina Faso, Mali, a number of other, are you familiar with the announcement that they're leaving ECOWAS?
Of course.
Your thoughts on what's going on there? Also, there was it in Uganda? There was a non-alignment meeting in which I think Vladimir Putin gave him a, spoke or something and said, "Hey, you're doing great work. Keep up the good work." So you've got like the rebirth of a non-alignment aligned movement. So those two things. The countries leaving ECOWAS and the non-aligned movement. I've got that somewhere. I'll look it up, the article. But your thoughts on that?
Well, sure. In Kampala, Uganda, the capital, there was an important meeting in the last few days, not only of the non-aligned meeting, but regional partners of Uganda and also the Group of 77, which is a kind of equivalent of the non-aligned movement. Recall that the non-aligned movement arose during the height of the Cold War, predominantly Asian, African, and Latin American nations that profess neutralism, which in Washington's terms was seen as being dangerously subversive. Recall that Cuba, for the longest time, was a spearhead of the non-aligned movement. And I should also say that with regard to the judgment at the International Court of Justice, and the number of opinions that were rendered, you might have seen that there was one dissenter, and that dissenter happened to be the Ugandan judge, Joyce Sabatinde, who, of course, was immediately and instantaneously rebuked and denounced by Kampala, by her government. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, apparently the fix was in. You probably should look for her nephews and children to be enrolling in Stanford by September of 2024. But in any case, that was also a positive sign with regard to African independence, that the government would rebuke this judge sitting on the ICJ. With regard to the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, all formerly part of the French neo-colonial empire, all of whom have had changes of government of late. And I would also include in that litany Guinea-Conakry, although it's not taken that measure of leaving ECOWAS, and also Chad, which has not left ECOWAS because it's not a part of it. But the leader was just in Moscow. You might have seen the photos of him shaking hands with President Putin. And so what's happening is that these West African states, particularly the aforementioned three, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, have had it up to their keister with Paris, for example, in its neo-colonial tricks. Recall that when you had the change of regime in Niger in July 2023, there was loose talk about Nigeria, the continent's giant and ECOWAS's giant, of intervening militarily. Interestingly enough, you might recall that President Tinubu only inaugurated about a year or so ago a former student at Chicago State University who left the United States a few decades ago under a cloud, to put it mildly. He was accused of money laundering and drug dealing. And we were informed that in the aftermath of the change of regime in neighboring Niger, that Vice President Harris was calling him and leaning on him, and a prominent journalist in Nigeria who's been trying to get the documents out of the United States so as to write this up for the Nigerian newspapers. Apparently the deal was effectuated that the documents would not be released anytime soon because there was serious talk about impeaching President Tinubu just after he had taken office, because he had not revealed all of these skeletons in his closet. So the point is that there's a lot of weakness with regard to his regime. And of course, Anthony Blinken also visited Nigeria during that recent jaunt through Africa, where I said he also visited Angola, because there's no love lost between Nigeria and South Africa, given the fact that they are the two giants economically of the continent. And obviously, Mr. Blinken and Washington are trying to use Nigeria as a cudgel against South Africa as well. But all of this maneuvering is a sign of desperation. All of this maneuvering is a sign of weakness. And once again, we will either bury U.S. imperialism or U.S. imperialism will bury us.
And let me read a statement. President Vladimir Putin gave a message to the summit, and it said, "We are fully united by our rejection of neo-colonialist ambitions, double standards, as well as forceful pressure, dictatorship, and blackmail as a means of achieving foreign policy and foreign economic goals." I will definitely make this the last thing. A lot of Americans don't understand the history of the Soviet Union in the anti-imperialist struggle in Africa, South America, etc. It seems to me that in their turn to the East, that the Russian Federation, led by Vladimir Putin, led by Sergei Lavrov, an absolutely brilliant statesman, have strongly, have decided to revisit their connections to Africa, to strengthen their connections to Africa, and to align themselves politically. And to some extent, I just read the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, said that we have, quote, I think he said, "We've received many missiles to defend our country, and we expect to receive more." Where they're coming from, I don't know, but we could surmise a couple of the possible origins of the weapons that are going there. And I suspect that these countries are being well armed, but wouldn't be the first time. Your thoughts on that the history of the Soviet, for those who don't know about the history of the Soviet Union in Russia, a little of the Soviet Union in Africa, a little on that, and your thoughts on what appears to be a reuniting of old friends.
Well, with regard to the former, I would like to point your audience to a few books that I've written on that subject. I wrote a book on the anti-apartheid struggle, and actually the struggle against U.S. imperialism in the southern cone of Africa, culminating in Nelson Mandela's election in 1994. You may recall that U.S. imperialism was a staunch ally of apartheid, as well as the Israeli regime, which collaborated with the apartheid regime up to and including nuclear collaboration. And despite the fact that Israel styled itself as an upholder of Jewish interests worldwide, it was collaborating with a violently anti-Jewish regime, including leaders who had collaborated with fascism in the 1940s, even though then U.S. President Ronald Reagan had somehow claimed that apartheid South Africa, racist South Africa, was an ally of the United States in the 1940s, when it was the exact opposite. I also wrote a book on Zimbabwe, which is the northern neighbor of South Africa. And of course, as you correctly point out, what allowed these struggling populaces to escape the snares of imperialism and colonialism was precisely assistance from the Soviet Union and its ally in Cuba. In fact, Cuba dispatched troops to that part of Africa in the mid-1970s, defeated the apartheid army on the battlefield, and that led directly to the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994, the independence of Namibia, formerly German Southwest Africa in 1990, not to mention the independence of Zimbabwe in 1980. And so I've taken careful note of the point that President Putin has made, which is that in a self-criticism, which is a praxis that I'd like to see more often displayed in Washington, he said that perhaps he and his comrades were a bit naive with regard to dealing with their neighbors in Western Europe and the North Atlantic countries, with regard to the Miss 1 and Miss 2. And obviously, they were being strung along. But now he says those days are over. And so part of the success in recent months, particularly since February 2022 and the special military operation of the Russian economy, is not only its burgeoning trade with China and its burgeoning relationship with India, to which it is selling petroleum, and then India marks it up and sends it to Europe, but also its relationship with Africa as well, as represented, as noted by the leader of Chad recently in Moscow, the leader Traore also shaking hands with Mr. Putin. So in response, as we speak, what is unfolding? What's unfolding is that there's a meeting in Rome, Italy, trying to be a kind of stand-in for the North Atlantic countries, meeting with African leaders, including the president of Zimbabwe and a number of other heads of state and government. So there's this competition right now for the favors of African nations. And if African nations play their cards right, they will be able to benefit. And more than that, their populations will be able to benefit.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horne. I certainly appreciate it. I was and your latest book. I know you have a book. Your most recent book is what?
Well, I have two new books out. One is Acknowledging Radical Histories. It's a book of conversations. Another is, I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader. In fact, in Los Angeles on Saturday, February 3rd, from 1 to 3, there'll be a book launch. Visit my Facebook page for details.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Gerald Horne. Certainly appreciate it, and I look forward to getting you back again soon.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. All right, everyone. That's Dr. Horne. And don't forget, you can find his books. Go online. He must have 20 or 30. God knows how many books out there. My favorite one is the book about Paul Robeson. It's an outstanding book. Everyone, don't forget, everything's sliding across there at the bottom, be it PayPal, Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, Cash App, whatever. Anything you can do to help the channel is appreciated. Additionally, make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. I am tired as can be, so I'm getting ready to hit the sack. But I am not on Twitter, so share it on Twitter. Go to rockfin.com/Garland Nixon, become a member there. In case they throw me off of YouTube, you can find me there. Doesn't cost a thing. I do do an occasional premium show on there, which is for premium members. Not many, one every now and then, and that's to be a subscriber is $14.99 a month. That's an option if somebody can afford that. I certainly appreciate it to help the channel on Rockfin. If you can't, that's okay. You can still be a Rockfin member and see 99% of my stuff anyway. Thanks a lot, everybody. Share this on all your social media platforms. Peace. I'm out.